Now, in his Aesthetics, von Hildebrand has a great deal to say about the way in which beauty nourishes the human spirit. He's always insisting, and it seems to me this is exactly in the vein of Roger Scruton, always insisting that the aesthetic experience is not simply a matter of being entertained. This experience goes much deeper and touches the sources of our real flourishing and our real happiness. He argues that the experience of beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity. And it follows that a life deprived of beauty is an impoverished life. This means that a world full of ugliness, a world in which beauty is often replaced by kitsch, is a world which oppresses and demeans and deforms the human spirit. Now, this leads me to the Hildebrandian contribution I would like to make to the discussion with Roger Scruton. I want to identify certain deprivations of the human spirit discussed by von Hildebrand and explain why von Hildebrand sees beauty as the antidote to these deprivations. In this way, he helps us understand quite concretely how it is that we are made for beauty and can't survive spiritually in a world that lacks it. So there are three deprivations, three antidotes coming from beauty. Here's the first. In his Aesthetics, von Hildebrand speaks about the prosaic, by which he means not just the everyday, like washing your hands, driving to work, but rather a certain aesthetic disvalue. He says, and I quote, "The quality of the prosaic emerges most clearly in certain human beings. The bureaucrat is specifically prosaic. The prosaic is the mechanization of the spirit, a mere soulless adhering to the shell of something. The Philistine is even more prosaic than the bureaucrat. This person thinks that things are real only in the sense of an austere usefulness. He regards everything else as a romantic trifle, an illusion, a waste of time. Such persons emanate a prosaic, oppressive, dull atmosphere." End of that quote. In the next sentence, von Hildebrand brings home to us academics the concept of the prosaic. He says, "The prosaic exists analogously in the world of the university. There is a specifically professorial dullness, a distressing pedantry, which constitutes a specific antithesis to true personal culture." End of that quote. So if you don't get the idea of the prosaic at first, you'll surely get it now when it's presented in its professorial form. Now, von Hildebrand wants to say that the prosaic constitutes a specific antithesis to beauty. The dullness of the prosaic is antithetical to the radiance of beauty. The prose of the prosaic is antithetical to the song of beauty. Von Hildebrand says that all beauty sings. There's perhaps no better way to characterize prosaic people than to say that they don't sing. They are devoid of the spirit of song. Now, what I most of all want to point out is that the prosaic type is an impoverished human being. And that by contrast, the type who sings in the presence of beauty has a full, abundant humanity. The professorial dullness and the distressing pedantry of certain intellectuals gives evidence of a withered existence as persons, whereas those who are deeply affected by beauty sing and give evidence of an awakened existence as persons. It follows that if a person wants to recover from his or her prosaic dullness, that person has to stop thinking of beauty as a romantic trifle and to start taking it seriously, letting its spirit of song affect him deeply. Beauty is then one main antidote to that flattening out of a person that von Hildebrand deplores in the bureaucrat and in other prosaic types. There's a second personal deformation for which von Hildebrand sees beauty as the antidote. In his Aesthetics, he writes extensively about what he calls the mediocrity of certain persons. By mediocre, he does not mean average, undistinguished, getting a grade of C. He rather has in mind a certain personal disvalue, a disvalue that forms a specific antithesis to beauty. He sees it embodied in the Philistine and the bourgeois. It's akin to the prosaic, but not exactly the same. Here is how he characterizes the mediocrity that concerns him in Aesthetics, and I quote, "The Philistine hates everything that is unconditional. He never wants to leave his warm nest or lose the solid ground under his feet. In keeping with this basic attitude, he regards all that is unconditional and heroic, all glowing enthusiasm, and the total gift of oneself as exaggerated. He does not wish to utter a Promethean protest against the world of values and ultimately against God, or to commit himself genuinely to them. He is not driven hither and thither by evil passions. He wants to remain on the golden middle ground in every sphere of life. He never wants to relinquish possession of himself to anything. He does not want to be swept off his feet by great passions or to be touched in the innermost depths by lofty goods which are greater than himself." End of that quote. Von Hildebrand proceeds to identify the opposite of this Philistine mediocrity. He speaks of a certain freedom of spirit, of a breadth of mind and heart, a capacity for that elevated existence that Plato called divine madness. But what most concerns us here is the antithesis between mediocrity and beauty. Again and again in his aesthetic writings, von Hildebrand quotes the significant saying of Ernst Delot, a French writer of the early 20th century, that, quote, "There is nothing the mediocre person hates as much as beauty." End of that quote. What is meant is that beauty, when it seizes us, draws us into a kind of divine madness, and this disrupts that security and control in which the mediocre person wants to ensconce himself. The mediocre person does not want to be beside himself, does not want to live ecstatically outside of himself, and so resents the call of beauty and sees it as something excessive and overwrought. Now, the point at which I'm driving is this. A mediocre person, as characterized by von Hildebrand, is a person with a greatly diminished humanity. And a person fascinated by beauty is a fully alive person. Beauty has the power to dislodge us from that small frame of reference in which we feel safe and to elicit from us the exuberance of a more abundant life. And if you wonder what I mean by exuberance, just recall the spirit of song that von Hildebrand sees in hearing in beauty. So, beauty is the antidote to the prosaic deformation of a person, and also the antidote to a mediocre deformation of a person. And of the many other such deformations surveyed by von Hildebrand, I pick out one more. That's my third and last. He discusses the disorder that a person obsessed with productivity suffers. There are people, plenty of them at the university, myself on many days included, who are consumed with their many projects, eaten up by them. They never come to rest, but are always driven to complete a project, to start another one. They feel that their existence is justified only if they are getting results and becoming ever more productive. Such people run the risk of turning themselves into instruments for production, and in this way depersonalizing themselves. Now, how does beauty, according to Van Hildebrand, heal persons who have lost themselves in their projects? In this way, beauty demands to be received, so he argues, in a contemplative attitude. The beautiful thing is lifted out of all pragmatic use and admired for its own sake. Sir Roger spoke of that in talking about the intrinsic value of beauty. The beautiful thing can show itself as beautiful only after you have silenced all your projects, all your use of instrumental reason, only after you have learned to dwell contemplatively with the beautiful thing. In this aesthetic contemplation, you come to yourself as person. You're no longer just one who exists for the sake of getting results, but somehow for your own sake. Van Hildebrand writes in his Aesthetics, the specifically contemplative element in the frui. Frui is the opposite of uti, meaning to use, frui meaning to take delight in. The specifically contemplative element in the frui of genuine beauty in nature and art has an eminent significance for the entire personality. Few things depersonalize a human being as much as the complete absorption in practical tasks. It is only when contemplation and contemplative acts receive their due in our lives that we can truly be persons. It is only then that we come to our true self. End of that quote. And I conclude laying this all in front of Sir Roger, eager for his reaction. I think there's a fundamental kinship with Van Hildebrand, but I'll let him determine that. And I conclude like this, that the loss of beauty in the contemporary world is not just a cultural loss, but an individual existential loss. It cripples persons. And beauty, for its part, is not just a cultural good, but an individual existential good. It has the power to regenerate persons.